On a crisp autumn afternoon in September 1995, 42-year-old Marcus Blackwood crouched down beside a moss-covered log in the dense forests of the Carpathian Mountains. With practiced precision, he sliced through the stem of a vibrant orange mushroom using his trusty pocket knife. Carefully placing the prized fungus into his woven basket, Marcus stood up and took a moment to absorb the breathtaking view of the mist-shrouded valley below. Marcus was on a mushroom foraging expedition with his wife Eliza and their close friends, Victor and Natalia Kovacs. The group had ventured into the remote wilderness surrounding the long-abandoned village of Valghast, nestled high in the mountains of northern Romania. It was Victor who had first suggested exploring this area, having heard intriguing tales about Valghast's dark history and the eerie legends that cloaked the deserted settlement. While Victor was captivated by the folklore, Marcus cared little for ghost stories and superstitions. His passion lay in mycology, and the opportunity to collect rare and delectable mushrooms in this untouched forest was irresistible. Back home in the bustling port city of Constanta, Marcus worked as a sous chef in a high-end restaurant. His days were a whirlwind of sizzling pans, shouted orders, and the constant pressure of the culinary world. This expedition offered a much-needed escape into nature's tranquil embrace. As Marcus scanned the forest floor for more mushrooms, his mind wandered to the feast he planned to prepare upon their return. He envisioned a medley of wild mushrooms sautéed in garlic butter, perhaps accompanied by a perfectly seared venison steak. The thought made his mouth water. The group slowly made their way uphill, their baskets gradually filling with an assortment of fungi. As they crested a ridge, the first signs of Valghast came into view. Crumbling stone walls and sagging timber frames emerged from the mist like the bones of a long-dead beast. Valghast had never been a large settlement, housing no more than 200 residents at its peak. The last inhabitants had fled over 6 decades ago, leaving the village to be reclaimed by nature. They approached a partially collapsed building on the outskirts of Valghast. Only 3 walls remained standing, the roof long since fallen in. From this vantage point, they could see down the village's main thoroughfare, a dirt path lined with the skeletal remains of houses and shops. About 150 meters away stood Valghast's centerpiece, a surprisingly well-preserved church with a tall, slightly leaning spire that seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Behind the church lay an overgrown cemetery, barely visible through the swirling mist. To the side, they could make out a murky pond, its surface broken by the occasional ripple of unseen creatures lurking beneath. The friends stood in silence, taking in the eerie scene before them. They had expected Valghast to be creepy. After all, its reputation as a haunted village was what had drawn Victor here in the first place. But now, faced with the reality of the abandoned settlement, they found themselves unnerved by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the ruins. Adding to the unsettling ambience, tendrils of mist began to creep through the village, slowly enveloping the decrepit buildings. Victor had mentioned that Valghast was known for its frequent, dense fogs, but seeing it firsthand was altogether different. The mist seemed almost alive, writhing and coiling around the structures like spectral fingers. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "Come on," he said, his voice tinged with excitement despite the foreboding surroundings. "I want to show you something." He grabbed Natalia's hand and began walking down the overgrown path toward the church. Marcus and Eliza followed, albeit with some hesitation. As they made their way deeper into Valghast, Marcus glanced back at the building they had just left. To his surprise, it had already vanished, swallowed by the rapidly thickening fog. A shiver ran down his spine, but he shook it off, telling himself it was just the damp chill in the air. Victor and Natalia came to a stop near a peculiar stone structure just off the main path. It was a rectangular monolith, standing about waist-high, its surface covered in faded carvings. Victor placed his hand on the stone, a look of satisfaction on his face. "This," he announced proudly, "is the Whispering Stone. Legend has it that it possesses dark powers." The Whispering Stone, Victor explained, was one of the oldest artifacts in Valghast. Centuries ago, when crusaders passed through the region on their way to the Holy Land, they would stop at this stone. They believed it could grant them strength and protection in the battles to come. Some even claimed to hear whispers emanating from the stone, offering prophecies or warnings. But the stone's reputation was not solely one of benevolence. Local lore spoke of its ability to trap souls, to open doorways to other realms filled with malevolent entities. Some said that touching the stone could draw you into these nightmarish worlds, never to return. As Victor regaled them with these tales, his hand remained firmly planted on the stone's surface. When he finished, he grinned at the others. So, who else wants to touch it? Natalia immediately backed away, shaking her head. Not a chance. I'm not about to tempt fate. Eliza, however, stepped forward. Oh, come on. It's just an old rock. She placed her hand on the stone's rough surface. For a moment, the group held their breath, as if expecting something dramatic to happen. When nothing did, they all chuckled nervously. As the laughter subsided, Marcus suddenly became aware of a change in the ambient sounds around them. The croaking of frogs from the nearby pond, which had been a constant background noise since they entered the village, had grown significantly louder. It was as if someone had suddenly turned up the volume to an almost deafening level. Frowning, Marcus turned to look in the direction of the pond. Through the swirling mist, he could barely make out the murky water's edge. As he squinted, trying to discern any unusual activity, the fog seemed to part for just a moment. In that brief instant, Marcus's eyes were drawn to one of the church's windows. What he saw made his blood run cold. A dark figure stood in the window, motionless, staring directly at Marcus and his companions. It seemed to be wearing some kind of hooded robe, but where its face should have been, there was only an inky blackness. Before Marcus could react or alert the others, the fog rolled back in, obscuring the window once more. Marcus stood frozen, his mind reeling. Had he really seen that figure, or was his imagination playing tricks on him? The oppressive atmosphere of Valghast must be getting to him, he reasoned. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of his stomach. His reverie was broken by Eliza's voice. "Hey, Marcus, your turn to touch the stone." Marcus turned back to the group, scanning their faces. They were all smiling and seemed relaxed, clearly unaware of what he had just witnessed, or thought he had witnessed. He glanced back toward the church, but the fog was too thick to see anything now. Pushing aside his unease, Marcus approached the whispering stone. All right, let's get this over with." He placed his hand on the cool surface of the monolith. Immediately, Marcus felt a change. The air around him seemed to grow colder, while the stone beneath his palm warmed. A strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of contentment mixed with an inexplicable urge to keep his hand in place. Part of him wanted to remain there, touching the stone, for hours. But deep in the recesses of his mind, a voice screamed at him to pull away, to get as far from the stone as possible. After what felt like an eternity but was likely only a few seconds, Marcus wrenched his hand from the stone's surface. As soon as he broke contact, the strange sensations vanished. The air returned to its normal temperature, and the compelling urge to touch the stone disappeared. Marcus blinked, feeling slightly disoriented. Eliza and Victor were grinning at him, clearly expecting some kind of reaction or description of his experience. But Natalia, who had been watching from a distance, spoke up before Marcus could gather his thoughts. "Can we please get away from this thing now?" she pleaded. "I really don't think we should be messing with it anymore." Victor chuckled and threw his arm around Natalia's shoulders. All right, let's explore some more of the village." He took Natalia's hand and began leading her further down the main path, in the direction of the church. Eliza quickly followed after them, her earlier apprehensions seemingly forgotten in the excitement of discovery. But Marcus hesitated. His encounter with the whispering stone had left him unsettled, and the memory of that dark figure in the church window lingered in his mind. Every instinct told him they should leave Valghast immediately. But Marcus didn't want to spoil the expedition for the others, especially not over what might have been nothing more than a trick of light and shadow. Reluctantly, he followed after his wife and friends, the fog swallowing him as he walked. As they neared the church, the croaking of the frogs grew even louder. The sound seemed to reverberate through the mist, making it difficult to tell which direction it was coming from. The group passed the murky pond, its surface now completely obscured by the fog. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from beneath those dark waters. They rounded the corner of the church, entering the overgrown cemetery behind it. Crumbling headstones jutted from the tall grass like rotten teeth, many of them so weathered that their inscriptions were no longer legible. Victor led them through the graves, occasionally stopping to examine a particularly interesting tombstone. As they wandered deeper into the cemetery, Eliza suddenly let out a startled cry. The others rushed to her side, finding her staring down at a freshly disturbed grave. The earth had been recently turned over, and deep claw marks scored the soil. What could have done this? Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. Victor crouched down to examine the grave more closely. Probably just some animal, he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Wild boars, maybe. They can do a lot of damage when they're rooting around. But Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Half buried in the loose soil was a scrap of fabric. He reached down and carefully pulled it free. It was a piece of dark cloth, similar in color and texture to the robe worn by the figure he had seen in the church window. Before he could point this out to the others, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the weathered tombstones. The group huddled together, eyes darting around wildly, trying to locate the source of the terrifying sound. "We need to get out of here," Natalia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." No one argued. They turned and began making their way back toward the cemetery entrance as quickly as they could, stumbling over hidden roots and half-buried stones. The fog had grown even thicker, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of them. As they neared the gate, Marcus realized with a start that Eliza was no longer with them. He called out her name, panic rising in his chest. There was no response. "Eliza!" he shouted again, louder this time. The only answer was the incessant croaking of the frogs, which had risen to an almost unbearable volume. Marcus turned to Victor and Natalia. "We have to find her," he said, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. They spread out, calling Eliza's name as they searched the cemetery. The fog seemed to muffle their voices, twisting the sound until Marcus wasn't sure if he was hearing his own shouts or those of his friends. As he moved between the graves, Marcus caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. Dark shapes flitted just out of sight, always disappearing when he turned to look directly at them. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence fell over the cemetery, broken only by the pounding of his own heart. Suddenly, Marcus's foot caught on something, sending him sprawling to the ground. As he pushed himself up, his hand touched something smooth and cold. He looked down and found himself face to face with a grinning skull, partially unearthed from a broken grave. Marcus scrambled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he did, he noticed something clutched in the skeleton's bony fingers. It was a small, leather-bound book. Despite his terror, curiosity got the better of him. He carefully pried the book free and opened it. The pages were filled with cramped, faded handwriting. As Marcus squinted to make out the words, he realized it was a journal. The entries detailed the final days of Valghast, written by one of its last inhabitants. With growing horror, Marcus read about a darkness that had descended upon the village, of people disappearing without a trace, and of something ancient and evil awakening beneath the church. The final entry was particularly chilling. "They come at night now, dark figures in robes, whispering promises of power and eternal life. But I've seen what becomes of those who listen. God help us all. If you're reading this, run. Run and never look back. Valghast is cursed and soon we'll all be dashed." The entry ended abruptly, a long ink stroke trailing off the page as if the writer had been suddenly interrupted. A twig snapped nearby, jolting Marcus back to the present. He looked up to see a hooded figure standing among the graves, identical to the one he had seen in the church window. Where its face should have been was only darkness, but Marcus could feel its gaze upon him. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the journal to his chest, and ran. The fog swirled around him, disorienting him further. He could hear movement all around, whispers, the rustle of robes, the scrape of something being dragged across stone. Marcus burst out of the cemetery and onto the main path of Valghast. He paused for a moment, gasping for breath and trying to get his bearings. That's when he saw her. Eliza was standing in front of the church, her back to him. Relief flooded through Marcus, and he called out to her. But as he approached, he realized something was wrong. Eliza was unnaturally still, and she didn't respond to his calls. When he reached her and gently turned her around, Marcus recoiled in horror. Eliza's eyes were wide open, but they were completely black, like empty voids. Her skin had taken on a gray, waxy appearance, and her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were speaking to someone Marcus couldn't see. "Eliza?" Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "Eliza, please. We need to go." Slowly, Eliza's head turned toward him. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. It was deep, resonant, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The sleeper has awakened," she intoned. "The gateway opens. All will be consumed." Before Marcus could react, the church doors behind Eliza burst open. A blast of fetid air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay and the sound of countless whispering voices. Dark, robed figures began to emerge from the church, their faceless heads turned toward Marcus. Terror overrode every other instinct. Marcus turned and ran, leaving Eliza behind. The fog closed in around him as he fled down the main path of Valghast. He could hear the pursuit behind him, the rustle of robes, the whispers growing louder, the sound of inhuman feet on the hard-packed earth. As he ran, the buildings of Valghast seemed to loom over him, their empty windows like hungry eyes watching his desperate flight. The mist swirled and eddied, sometimes revealing glimpses of dark figures closing in from all sides. Marcus's lungs burned, and his legs ached, but he didn't dare slow down. He clutched the journal he had found to his chest, its presence somehow reassuring even in the midst of this nightmare. Just when he thought he couldn't run any further, Marcus burst out of the fog and found himself at the edge of Valghast. The forest lay before him, dark and forbidding, but infinitely preferable to what lurked behind him in the cursed village. Without hesitation, Marcus plunged into the woods. Branches whipped at his face, and roots threatened to trip him, but he pressed on. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the normal noises of the forest at night. Still, Marcus didn't slow his pace until he literally couldn't run anymore. He collapsed at the base of a large tree, his chest heaving as he gulped in great lungfuls of air. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had happened crashed down upon him. Eliza, Victor, Natalia. He had left them all behind in that hellish place. Tears streamed down Marcus's face as he sat there, trying to catch his breath and grappling with the horror of what he just experienced. He suddenly remembered the journal clutched in his hands. With trembling fingers, he opened it once more, hoping to find some explanation, some way to save his wife and friends. The faded pages seemed to come alive in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. Marcus read feverishly, his eyes darting across the cramped handwriting. The journal belonged to a man named Alexandru Popescu, who had been the village priest in Valghast's final days. Alexandru wrote of an ancient evil that had slumbered beneath the village for centuries. It had been contained by a series of rituals and sacrifices, a terrible burden passed down through generations of villagers. But as the outside world encroached and younger residents left for cities, the old ways were forgotten. The rituals ceased, and the evil began to stir. The priest described how the entity manifested first in dreams, then in waking nightmares. People began to disappear, only to return changed, their eyes black and their minds no longer their own. The Whispering Stone, once a source of guidance and protection, became a conduit for the entity's malevolent influence. As Marcus read on, his blood ran cold. Alexandru's final entry spoke of a prophecy that one day, unwitting outsiders would enter Valghast and inadvertently break the last seals holding the entity at bay. When this happened, the entity would fully awaken, using the village as a gateway to spread its influence across the world. With growing horror, Marcus realized that he and his companions had fulfilled this prophecy. Their innocent exploration and interaction with the Whispering Stone had set in motion a catastrophic chain of events. But all was not lost. In his final entry, Alexandra wrote of a potential way to stop the entity. Deep beneath the church lay a hidden chamber, accessible only through a secret passage in the cemetery. Within this chamber was an artifact of immense power, the heart of Valghast. If it could be destroyed, the entity's connection to our world would be severed, and its influence would dissipate. Marcus closed the journal, his mind reeling. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of returning to that nightmarish village filled him with dread. Yet the alternative, leaving Eliza, Victor, and Natalia to their fate, was unthinkable. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed himself to his feet. He oriented himself using the stars peeking through the canopy and began the arduous journey back to Valghast. As he walked, he formulated a plan. He would need to find the secret passage, locate the heart of Valghast, and destroy it, all while avoiding the robed figures and whatever other horrors awaited him. The trek back seemed to take an eternity. Every shadow held potential danger. Every snapping twig sent his heart racing. But finally, the mist-shrouded silhouette of Valghast loomed before him once more. Marcus crept through the village, staying close to the crumbling walls of the buildings. The fog had thickened even further, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The croaking of the frogs had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the occasional whisper carried on the wind. He made his way to the cemetery, his eyes darting constantly, searching for any sign of movement. As he passed the church, Marcus thought he saw shapes moving behind the windows, but he forced himself not to look too closely. In the cemetery, Marcus began searching for any sign of the secret passage mentioned in Alexandra's journal. He examined tombstones, looking for unusual markings or hidden mechanisms. Time seemed to stretch as he moved from grave to grave, always alert for the approach of the robed figures. Just as he was about to give up hope, Marcus noticed something odd about one of the larger mausoleums. The stone door was slightly ajar, and a faint, sickly green light emanated from within. Steeling himself, Marcus approached and pulled the door open. A narrow staircase led down into darkness. The green light pulsed faintly from somewhere below, casting writhing shadows on the damp stone walls. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then began his descent. The air grew colder and heavier with each step. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light. Marcus could hear a low, rhythmic chanting coming from somewhere ahead, the words in no language he recognized. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus found himself in a vast underground chamber. Rows of pillars stretched into the darkness, each adorned with grotesque carvings. In the center of the chamber stood a raised dais, upon which rested a pulsing, crystalline object, the heart of Valghast. Surrounding the dais were dozens of robed figures, swaying in unison as they chanted. With a jolt of horror, Marcus recognized three figures standing apart from the rest: Eliza, Victor, and Natalia. Their eyes were black voids, and their faces were masks of rapture as they gazed upon the heart. Marcus knew he had to act quickly. He scanned the chamber, looking for anything he could use to destroy the heart. His eyes fell upon an ancient battle axe mounted on one of the pillars. It looked ceremonial, but it would have to do. Taking a deep breath, Marcus darted from his hiding place behind a pillar. He sprinted towards the axe, praying he wouldn't be noticed. Just as his fingers closed around the weapon's handle, a piercing shriek filled the air. The chanting stopped abruptly. As one, the robed figures turned towards Marcus. He could feel the weight of their eyeless gazes upon him, filled with malevolence and hunger. With no time to think, Marcus charged towards the dais. The robed figures moved to intercept him, their movements unnaturally fast and fluid. Marcus swung the axe wildly, keeping them at bay as he closed in on his target. He leapt onto the dais, raising the axe high above his head. The heart of Valghast pulsed faster, as if sensing the danger. Just as Marcus was about to bring the axe down, a familiar voice called out, "Marcus, stop." It was Eliza's voice, but distorted, layered with something ancient and evil. Marcus hesitated, turning to look at his wife. Her black eyes bored into him as she spoke again. "Join us, Marcus. Embrace the power. We can be together forever." For a moment, Marcus felt the pull of her words. A part of him wanted to give in, to surrender to whatever force had taken hold of Valghast. But then he remembered the journal, the warnings, the prophecy. He knew what he had to do. "I'm sorry, Eliza," he whispered. With all his strength, Marcus brought the axe down upon the heart of Valghast. The crystal shattered with a sound like 1,000 screaming voices. A blinding light erupted from the fragments, bathing the chamber in searing white radiance. The robed figures howled in agony, their forms seeming to melt and dissipate in the light. Marcus felt a great pressure building in his head, threatening to split his skull. He closed his eyes and held on to the memory of Eliza, not as she was now, but as she had been before all of this. And then, suddenly, silence fell. Marcus opened his eyes to find the chamber transformed. The sickly green light was gone, replaced by the warm glow of torches. The grotesque carvings on the pillars had vanished, and the air no longer felt heavy with malevolence. On the floor around him lay Eliza, Victor, and Natalia, unconscious but breathing. The robed figures were nowhere to be seen. As Marcus knelt beside his wife, her eyes fluttered open, normal, human eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Marcus," Eliza whispered. What happened? Where are we?" Before Marcus could answer, a new voice spoke from the shadows. "You have done it. You have freed us all." An elderly man stepped into the light. He wore the robes of a priest, tattered and faded with age. His face was lined with centuries of worry, but his eyes shone with gratitude and relief. "I am Alexandru Popescu," the man said. "Or rather, I was. My spirit, along with those of all Valghast's victims, has been trapped here for generations. We were forced to serve the entity, to lure in new victims. But now, thanks to your bravery, we are finally free." As Alexandru spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows. Men, women, and children from different eras, all bearing the same look of newfound peace. They gathered around Marcus and his friends, murmuring thanks and blessings. "The evil that plagued Valghast is gone," Alexandru continued. "Its influence will fade from the world. You have saved countless lives, Marcus Blackwood." Marcus helped Eliza to her feet, supporting her as Victor and Natalia also stirred. "What happens now?" he asked. Alexandru smiled, his form already beginning to fade. "Now, we can rest, and you, brave souls, can return to your lives. But remember this place and the danger that once lurked here. Some evils are best left undisturbed." With those final words, Alexandru and the other spirits vanished, leaving Marcus and his companions alone in the chamber. They made their way back to the surface, emerging into a forest that seemed brighter somehow, as if a great shadow had been lifted. As they began the long journey home, Marcus knew that their lives would never be the same. They had faced an ancient evil and emerged victorious, but the memory of Valghast would stay with them forever. He clutched Eliza's hand tightly, grateful beyond words to have her back, and silently vowed to cherish every moment they had together. The tale of Valghast and the bravery of Marcus Blackwood would be passed down through generations, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in forgotten places and the light that can banish it. And though the village would eventually crumble to dust, its legacy would live on as both a warning and a testament to the power of courage in the face of unimaginable horror. Hit that like button if you felt the chill of Valghast's curse. Subscribe and ring the notification bell to venture into more haunted villages, cursed artifacts, and spine-tingling mysteries.